I think we can be sure that it's not just a label enemy that Jesus is talking about here for various reasons. Probably most of you don't even need me to go into this, but there will be some who will be, oh, well, you call them an enemy, they're an enemy. Okay, so, I mean, often he obviously refers to the inner feelings of people in other things he talks about. Like lust. You've actually committed adultery in your heart. He talks about, even though you haven't done it physically. And also, it would be just trivial because if he's just talking about those we label an enemy, then all we have to do to get round this saying is just to not label them an enemy. So we could just say, well, they're not an enemy, they're just someone I don't like, or they're an antagonist, or they're an enemy. Not an enemy, enemy. Ha! Now I don't have to turn the other cheek. So obviously he's really referring to that feeling, that demonization, that hatred, that making a monster of, that adults do, particularly in warfare, where the the group that we're in a war with, we turn them into a monster in our hearts. And it got me to thinking about, well, why do we do that? And it doesn't just happen in warfare. I watched a film recently, and I mean, I don't know how accurate this is, but it felt very accurate. There was some criminals in the film, and they were really nasty. They they entrap people into debt, and then they use that debt to strip all their assets. Nothing to do with banks and vulture funds and mortgage prisoners, of course. But anyway, and what's interesting was the criminals kind of turned their victims into enemies. They called them losers, and they went further than that. They really hated them. And of course, the psychology behind that is fairly obvious. It gets you off the hook psychologically. If you're victimizing somebody, that's going to be grating at your conscience, what's left of it. But if you if you turn them into an enemy, into a monster, into a beast in your mind, in your heart, then that will relieve some of that psychological burden and make it more possible for you to victimize. And then I realised maybe this is what Jesus is talking about. And if we look at the Second World War, again, there was a point where, from what I can tell, Britain particularly started to regard the Nazis in this way, and the German people. And in fact, they still do. A lot of people in this country still do have that attitude. I know my mother did. She hated Germans all her life. I, luckily, somehow managed not to pick that up, and I actually lived in Germany for 5 years and found them to be wonderful people in general, and had a great time. So, and the language is amazing, the philosophy, oh, wow. So, that's an aside. But there came a point in the Second World War where Britain, as a country, stopped regarding the Nazis and the Germans as just an aggressor and a competitor nation, who in fact had so much in common with Britain, and probably would have done a deal with Britain at a drop of a hat if they could have done. Unfortunately, Churchill had no interest in that. But I'm going aside again. But there came a point where I think Britain really switched in its attitude to Germany. And after years and years of bombings, years and years of terror, years and years of struggle and death and deprivation, a lot of people in Britain became to hate the Nazis and hate Germany, Germans, and that was the point where they really became an enemy. Because it was at that point that Britain really lusted for revenge and for blood, and really Britain became an aggressor as well at that point, because now it wasn't just defending ourselves or putting the Nazis back in their box, it was something else. And we can contrast that with the American attitude, which I think was very different. And I think America saw, and a lot of the soldiers, American soldiers, saw it as a kind of internal European conflict, an internecine they call it, like a family kind of conflict within Europe, and they sort of were coming over to sort it out. And let's face it, they did. Them and the Russians, and of course Britain, France, Poland, so many nations came together, which just reinforces my contention that the Nazis were that close to victory. But I don't think the Americans had that history of deprivation and destruction that Britain did, obviously. And, you know, including the First World War. I mean, a lot of people argue that the First and Second World War were very much connected and were really part of the same war. And that's partly because after the First World War, there was a continuation of revenge through the Versailles Treaty, which was very, very damaging to Germany and very punitive, and very much motivated by the French, because they had suffered so much, and they wanted revenge. And who can blame them? And the British wanted revenge. But I think there was a point where the Germans went from being an enemy in label only and became an enemy in the hearts of people. And it was mostly the British and the French, of course, but not the Americans. and if we contrast their two attitudes, we can see the difference. And it was also the Americans at the end of the Second World War who insisted on rebuilding Germany, putting it back on its feet. The British and the French wouldn't have done that. Not at all. And they would be lucky. And the Russians. Oh my God. I mean, the Russians. So, and was it that stopped a Third World War? The Marshall Plan? Arguably, it was. And we should be forever grateful to those leaders and to the American people who politically were able to support that, because that was a miracle, really. So I think we can really see the difference here between enemy as a label and enemy in the heart. And we can see the ones who had the enemy in the heart were bombing German cities. The British were bombing Leipzig, Dresden, Hamburg. The Americans were doing daylight precision bombing of military targets and industrial targets. Britain were doing night bombing with fire and killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. And of course it was kind of justified as, well, some of them are soldiers on leave. There's bound to be some military equipment in the city, and we can't do it accurately like the Americans. We don't want to fly in the daytime because we get a lot more of our own guys killed doing that. But really deep down, I think revenge was very much part of it. And I think the Americans, again, to give them credit, didn't even really want revenge on the Japanese, and they were they were more attacked and more threatened, I think, by the Japanese than the Germans directly. And it was a bloody long conflict to get them back onto Japan, and then they gave them a left hook in Nagasaki, and when they got back up again, they gave them a right hook in Hiroshima. And that time they stayed down. Yeah, that's how I would interpret it. But anyway, big aside again. But I think what I'm trying to do is contrast the two attitudes. They both would have called the Nazis the enemy, but one had really become the enemy in their hearts. And this is this is the breakthrough, I think, with understanding this, is that maybe it was at that point that Britain could have turned the other cheek. Maybe there was a chance, an agreement, a truce at that point, where we'd become the aggressor. And we were starting to take our vengeance. And maybe if we'd offered, at that point, a deal, and I believe even some people in the Nazi regime were trying to make a deal near the end of the war. And unfortunately, in retrospect, we weren't having any of it. We wanted our pound of flesh, let's face it. And it's understandable. But I think Jesus is saying it would have been better if we hadn't. And we'd be more like the Americans. And if it had just been the Americans, would they have done a deal? Certainly the Russians wouldn't have been interested. But maybe if Britain and America had said we want to do a deal, maybe the Russians would have gone along with it. But with Britain and Russia not interested, let's finish these fuckers. It wasn't possible. And it would have been a very different world today, perhaps. So this is the thing. I think what he's saying is we need to recognise when we've turned our antagonist into an enemy in our hearts. And we, at that point, the reason we've turned them into an enemy is because we need to psychologically to justify to ourselves the evil we are now doing, the abuse we are now doing. This is the motivation for for making them into an enemy. Not just calling them, but actually psychologically creating this monster that was human beings. And this is why we do it. Because we want something. We want revenge. Or we want to exploit them. And so often it's the victim that's actually being turned into an enemy. And that's why we should turn the other cheek. We should change what we're doing from attacking or defending ourselves from this monster that we've created, and in fact give them an opportunity to change their behaviour by exposing ourselves to another attack. Because suddenly we'll find the monster isn't a monster. Perhaps. Maybe I'll have to try it myself sometime. So that's my thoughts on Jesus is saying on enemies, and enemies more generally. So I hope that you found it interesting, and let me know in the comments what you think. See ya.